So Spengler, as I was saying, for Spengler, the arts are trying to do something. They're dynamically engaged in a process of actualizing their potentialities, realizing them, not just randomly, but in the sense that they are creating and articulating a culture's understanding of being. Uh, if we look at, for example, the evolution of classical music, or let's say the evolution of art as it moves in Faustian Northern European civilization from the period of the Gothic through the Renaissance to the Baroque and on into the 19th century, what we see is a process of the working out, of the shedding of the classical pseudomorphosis. We saw last time what the pseudomorphosis was. It's the importation or the influence on one civilization of a dead form language that the civilization has to figure out how to shed, how to get rid of, so that it can therefore realize its own most sense of what it understands being as. It's a little bit like the artist coming to maturity under his masters, imitating them, and then getting rid of their influences, so that through that process he can then find his own style, his own voice. So each civilization has to come to an understanding with itself. It has to find its own voice by mastering and shedding the dead form language of previous civilizations. And just about all the civilizations, as I've said, with the exception of the Egyptian, and to some extent the Hindus, have had a pseudomorphic influence from another civilization that they've had to shed and get rid of, and it takes them a while to do this. But in the West then, so the arts move from, in the Gothic period to the Baroque via the Renaissance. And he says then that in this process, he says that classical music is going to be the primary great art form for the West. It doesn't yet know this, in its Gothic period, in essence. It doesn't know that this is going to be its grand art of form. It has to figure it out over time. By the time of Mozart and Beethoven, it's got it all figured out and mapped out, and it moves into its final phase at that point. But with the rise of Gregorian chant, where the voice, the human voice, dominates during the period of the cathedrals, the voice is dominant. And Spengler says there's a basic opposition here. Remember from a previous discussion of his opposition of imitation versus ornament. Ornament is the world as nature, with its symbolism and its strict theory and laws of theory that are worked out. Polyphony is also worked out in Faustian music at this time, which is in utter contradistinction to the Greek harmony and melody, basically Greek melody, monophony. That's in opposition to the Faustian polyphony, where you have multiple lines going at the same time. This is worked out in the Gothic period at the same time that stained glass is coming in and the cathedrals are rising, and we get this sense of this is the realm of ornamentation. Then in the realm of imitation, almost lost my train of thought. The realm of imitation is the realm of the troubadours, the music, the secular music of the troubadours and the minnesingers, the people at court, in the castle. And when you listen to the music, you can hear it very clearly, the opposition there. Gregorian chant versus the music, the fun, happy music with lots of drums and tambourines and wind instruments going on in the castle, in the cottages and in the village. This basic opposition of village and the life of the world and celebration versus the world of the strict laws of theory is already articulating itself there in the Gothic period with this opposition. Then as it evolves and develops, this music gradually develops into, he says, Palestrina and Orlando de Lasso finish off this a cappella style. With their a cappella style of music, they finish off this very bodily, very un-Gothic, un-Faustian music. They finish it off, and it begins to move into the Baroque style. And with the Baroque style, we begin to get, with the rise of the cantata and the oratorio, and the rise of instrumental chamber music, we begin to get this sense of music beginning to free itself from everything earthly and concrete. The voice gradually begins to fade out. The basso continuo comes in as the basic canvas upon which the musical colors and tones are painted. And then with the Baroque fulfilling itself with Bach, who dies in 1750, I believe, that ends that epoch of music where the music is beginning to pull itself away from everything bodily and beginning to etherealize itself. And he says, and then in the next epoch with Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, the great masters file on stage, the voice is largely gone from the music, the human voice. The basso continuo disappears, and you get the rise of the symphony and the concerto grosso, and you get the sense that music is this vast, he says the stringed instrument is the primary Faustian instrument that best expresses its sense of the dematerializing effect of what Western civilization is trying to do, which is the exact opposite of what classical civilization did. It's with classical civilization, you have the emphasis is on the material aspect. And also in their art, it is the figure without ground, the figure minus ground, that is best exemplified for them with sculpture. And this period, 650 to 350, corresponds in the West to 1500 AD to 1800 AD. That's the grand period of the realization of these styles. The bodiliness, he says that, whereas in the West it was sculpture that fell out. Basically, Michelangelo is the last great sculptor, the last truly great sculptor, in which we can say that the sculptor's works are as great as the works of a Bach or a Beethoven or a Rembrandt. He says later sculptors, Pigalle and Rodin. Rodin's a displaced painter. However great their talents are, they aren't necessary to the culture. They're not monumental achievements on the scale of a Bach or a Beethoven or a Mozart. And so sculpture was, for the West, the art form that fell out. For the West, what is trying to be realized is not the figure minus the ground, as it is for the Greeks, and in which case with the Greeks it's music that basically falls out. And their music correspondingly also becomes, it undergoes a reverse process of starting with stringed instruments, with the Dorian lyre, and gradually moving to the wind instruments, the aulos, the Ionic aulos, and the syrinx. It becomes more bodily, the music does, but eventually it becomes regarded as a superfluous medium by comparison with sculpture, which begins to realize itself, and it begins to shed the Egyptian pseudomorphosis so that you get the full sense of the sculpture as a three-dimensional figure in the round, fully shed of the Egyptian influence. And he says that basically the evolution of Greek sculpture is a movement and a shedding of the influence of the planar fresco, and its shedding with the relief style of Egyptian sculpture. You can see this, how sculpture evolved. Spengler's theory is that sculpture evolved from relief work, gradually detached itself from the wall, but with Egyptian sculpture, the statue is always pure front. It's never meant to be experienced in the round, the way the Greeks did. And you can see the influence of that planar emphasis, that full frontality of the Egyptian statue on the Greek statue, first with the Kouros grave statues, where the statue is directly in front, and then by the time you get down to Myron's disc thrower and so forth, you have, and with Lysippus, you have the full three-dimensional sense of the sculpture is completely three-dimensional in the round. It has realized itself, stepped away from the niche, and has become its own world unto itself. And so then, by that point, sculpture achieves itself. It declines into the Hellenistic period after 350 AD and becomes more or less superfluous, random, and nonsensical, basically the way Spengler sees. The last great classical musicians for him are Wagner, Liszt, and Bruckner. Everybody after that is just a mere dabbler and wasting his time. I guess it goes without saying Spengler didn't like Mahler. But so that's where the arts of form, that's the process that's going on. The West is trying to dissolve the figure back into the ground. And you can see this very clearly in painting. And this happens in the evolution of Western painting at the same time that this bodiliness, this bodilessness is beginning to overtake the classical music. So too in the painting you see it with beginning really with the Venetian school with Giorgione and Titian. You can begin to see the background start coming in with Leonardo and his invention of sfumato with aerial perspective. He's the first to begin to slowly unshackle painting from its harness to sculpture, which is best exemplified. I think it achieves its apotheosis with Raphael. But he begins to blend and melt the figures into the background. Already you can see this in the Mona Lisa. The background is becoming, if you look at the evolution of Leonardo's pictures, the background gets wider and bigger until by the time of Mona Lisa, one of his last paintings, it's gigantic. She is still figure, but she's figure with ground, not figure minus ground. As for the Greeks, both their vase paintings, which are pure figures with no background, And in their sculpture, it's only figure minus ground that mattered for them, and they're trying to eliminate the background, because the background is space, and it's space that the classical civilization is trying to eliminate, just as we, Northerners, space is of the essence. That's precisely what's coming into being here, and we're trying to dissolve the figure back into the ground. So as painting evolves in the 17th century, it moves on with the Dutch masters. They introduce the horizon line, which we'd already seen coming in, of course, with Leonardo and Giorgione. But the horizon line becomes a primary symbol for Spengler in Faustian painting. It is of the essence of the whole thing, because it introduces the sense of depth thrust into distance. And it's the distance thing that's coming into being, that's being materialized and realized here through Faustian painting. So by the time you get to the Dutch masters of the 17th century, they're only painting backgrounds. The figures have dissolved entirely into the background. The landscape painting is the preferred art motif, and this sense of expansion into infinite space is the realized thing that's going on at the same time as Descartes is inventing the infinitesimal calculus in mathematics, and at the same time as in the 17th century, the Baroque style of classical music is coming in with Bach and Handel, and the Baroque is becoming, everything Baroque, Spengler says, is basically music. So by the time you get to the 18th century, sculpture is no longer the primary influence, it's music. Music, whether you're looking at the paintings of Watteau or Fragonard, whether you're looking, or Guardi, whether you're looking at the architecture of the 18th century with the Dresden Zwinger, it's all music. It's all music. That's the primary art form of the 18th century, which is why we always think of the 18th century painting as a decline, as inferior to the painting that climaxes in the 17th century with the great Dutch masters. And as Spengler says, for Rembrandt, there are no foregrounds. Rembrandt is only a painter of backgrounds. He has so dissolved the subject back into this sense of infinite space. So music then, classical music takes over from where painting leaves off, which painting completes its mission there by about 1700, which is at the time that it's handing the baton over to Bach, who then begins to realize this whole new form world in sound, which is much more consistent with the Faustian sense of dematerializing the real, of dematerializing the sensible world, of blowing it out the same way in the Gothic cathedral we got with the flying buttress and the rise of the stained glass window, the blowing out of the walls of the cathedral and expansion through infinite space as the basic Faustian idea that's going on here, this thing that's trying to be realized through the Faustian arts of form. And then so he says that the appearance of the brushstroke with Titian is the first to begin to introduce the brushstroke in painting. You have a symbol of the highest inward significance, because the brushstroke, in contrast to the painting of the Florentines, which is very chiseled, still under the influence of sculpture, the brushstroke is the key to the beginnings of what dissolves the forms, until by the time you get to Impressionism, the forms are completely dissolved into the space itself. And the brushstroke introduces this sense of what he says we Faustians like. We like this sense of things becoming. Not things become, as for the Greeks, but things becoming. The brushstroke, and we especially have a preference for unfinished things. We like the fact that Leonardo didn't finish all of his paintings. We love sketches, and we have a Faustian love of ruins. The patina that appears, the greenish patina that appears on ancient bronzes are for us of the essence, whereas the patina for the Greek would have been regarded as the ruin of the work. And so the brushstroke is the key thing that comes in here from Titian down to the Impressionists. It's the key technique that begins to dissolve bodily physical things into their spaces, into the gigantism of the space. And he also says there's an opposition in the colors. The Greeks preferred yellow and red. These are the colors of the near, the popular colors. Everything classical is popular, everything Faustian is esoteric. But they're near, they're concrete, they're tangible, whereas for the West it's blue, green, and brown. Blue is the color of the sky, and the Greeks didn't even have a word for blue, actually. And blue is not a color that appears much, it's not a selected color, except in incidental cases in Greek art. And he says that blue and green is the primary color that's selected for the southern European world. This is the primary, think of Raphael. But in the north it's brown, and especially this Rembrandt brown that we first begin to see appearing in the Florentine painters with Titian and Giorgione. and that gradually migrates. Rembrandt becomes the master of this brown, and then it's finished off by the German Romantic painters of the 19th century. And this brown, Spengler says, the key thing about it is that it's metaphysical. Brown is the one color that doesn't appear on the rainbow. And it's a color that, for these artists, especially for Rembrandt, has a cosmic, metaphysical, dematerializing, unearthly significance to it.